Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. My name is Sean. Today we have a very special guest from Akron, Ohio. He's been to Lunch with Books before, so he's a veteran. His name is David Giffels. You will remember his book, The Hard Way on Purpose. He is a former Akron Beacon Journal columnist. His writing has appeared in New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The Parade, Wall Street Journal, Esquire, he wrote for Beavis and Butt-Head. He's won a lot of awards for his writing, including the Cleveland Arts Excellence Award, and many others. He is a professor of English at the University of Akron, where he teaches creative nonfiction. Here is David Giffels.
Thanks, Sean. Hello, West Virginia. I'm coming to you live from my attic in Akron, Ohio. It's weird to be living life this way. I had a really great visit a few years ago to the Ohio County Library and to Wheeling, and made some new friends there. Got to go to lunch downtown and walk around the town a little bit, and really loved Wheeling. Reminds me a lot of Akron in a lot of ways. The architecture of industrial and former industrial cities shares a kinship, and the spirit of the people seems to do the same. So I'm a little sorry not to be there live. It's a beautiful day here in Akron. I hope it is there too. But I am very glad and thankful to Sean and the library for having me back, and to be able to talk about my book, Furnishing Eternity. A Father, a Son, a Coffin, and a Measure of Life. This book came out a couple of years ago, and I'll tell you a little bit about the book and how it came about and what I was thinking when I was writing it. And then I'm going to read a little piece of it, which will be weird because basically I will be reading this book to the machine that I wrote it on, which is a little bit meta, but that's okay. The machine seems to like me so far. And then I hope that there will be a way to interact, because one of the things I remember distinctly and fondly about my visit to Wheeling was how engaged you all were as an audience. So let's see how you do in this format of ours. So Furnishing Eternity is a memoir. It's an account of my experience building a casket with my father as he was entering his 80s, which is an odd concept for a book, admittedly. And it was an odd concept for a life project as well. And the piece I'm going to read to you will explain a little bit more how this came about. But essentially what happened is I have always built things with my father. That's kind of the way we bonded, was in his workshop, which was one of my favorite places to spend time with him. And as he was entering his 80s, I had this idea that we would build a casket together, mainly because it was going to be an excuse to find a way to spend time with him. It would be sort of a project that would sort of force us together in that workshop for a while. So it was kind of my secret scheme to spend some valuable dad time with him, as knowing that he was late in his life. But very soon, once that process began, as a writer, I began thinking about this conceptually. I was nearing age 50. I was starting to think about life and mortality in a new way. And it was a little bit hard not to see building a coffin as an obvious metaphor for life and mortality. And so, I was sort of thinking like big boy writer stuff, like this will be my way to address one of the big themes, death and, and life and all of that. And so it kind of started out that way. That's how the book began. The book was going to be, sort of primarily about this process and my sort of musing about mortality and midlife and so forth. And something that I should have learned a long time ago, and I think I've always known as a writer, is that, especially with a big writing project, whenever a writer thinks he or she has gotten an idea and is controlling that idea, the idea will turn on you in a way that will not only surprise you, but also completely change the project. I teach writing, creative writing at the University of Akron, and I also often tell my students that we don't get ideas, ideas get us. And in the arrogant part of our lives as writers, we believe that we have come up with the idea, and we believe that we control the idea and bring it to fruition. But as we become necessarily humbled by the process, we remember again and again that the ideas get us. The ideas control the projects. So I thought I had this idea to write about mortality and woodworking and so forth. And we were getting underway, and the book had gotten underway. And about a year into it, my mother died. She died. She had cancer, but she had gotten better, and then she had a sudden and very quick and devastating downturn, and she died. And this was the first person that close to me that I had lost. I had been, I guess, lucky to have lived, well into my 40s without losing somebody so close to me. So, of course, her death became an important part of the book. I knew I was going to have to write about it, and suddenly I was going to have to write about it within the chaos of the event, within the grief and the trying to put together the pieces of what it means to lose somebody like that. And anyone who's lost somebody, anyone who's lost someone close like that, knows that in the immediate and in the early aftermath, it's very difficult to understand what's happened, and it's very difficult to reconcile this person who was alive and with you only a short time ago and is no longer there. And one thing I remember doing was a lot of weird math. In the weeks after my mother died, I would constantly calculate the number of days that had passed since I had last spoken a word to her. And I would constantly be calculating, when was the last time she was in my house? It's almost like we're trying to reach over the divide into the past. And so I was trying to understand all of this sort of confusing and new information, knowing I also had to write about it in some kind of coherent way. So it was very difficult. But it was the first step of what I talked about before, of recognizing that the idea is going to turn and change on you. And so this was no longer conceptual, it was actual. I was writing about death and loss in a way that was much different than I thought. And so I continued to make my way forward through the process. And then exactly 1 year and 3 days after my mother's death, my closest friend, who was my age, died of cancer, but very unexpectedly. He had been fighting through cancer and seemed to have gotten better, and then took a very sudden downturn as well. And he died. And so now I'm confronted with the first loss of somebody close to me, and now the first loss of somebody my own age very close to me. So this whole idea of mortality was taking on these much, much different, heavier and more intense permutations. And so the book changes very much. It becomes very much about friendship and the temporariness of life that we don't like to think about that much. But also the fun of writing about a lifelong friend in a way that is shared. I almost feel like my friend John was a collaborator on this book because of the way he informed the way I told his story. And I don't want to paint this as a sad book. I think there's some difficult confrontations in it, but I like to think that I was writing about life even more than I was writing about death. And so this process continued, and my father was interesting because he's the constant in the book. He was a great foil because he had a sense of humor about this. And after my mother died, he had a sense of enjoying every day. He knew, we all know our days are numbered, but when you're getting into your 80s and you've lost your life partner, there are a lot of ways to confront it. My dad confronted it by just wanting to spend as much time with the people he loved and doing the things that he enjoyed doing. And he was spontaneously going on trips and setting up dinner plans and throwing parties and doing all these things that were really informative on how to live the days of your life. And also he was very curious about this book because he was very aware. While we were in his workshop, I would often go over and write things down in my notebook that I always had with me. And so he knew he was a character, but he was trying to just sort of be himself as he was going along. And so one of the things that I wondered was, how he would perceive this book when it became an actual book. The book came out in January of 2018. And he got to read the book and got to see the early response to it. But then in the sort of the final act of writing and art kind of teaching us not to think that we're in control, my father passed away 3 days after the book came out. So it was almost like the completion of this lesson to me that, and also that made this book more important to me, that it was a document of how life's unpredictability is its sort of only truth, and how much we need to appreciate the people that we have and the time we have with them when we have them. I have no regrets. I'm so glad that I did this project with my dad and that we got to share it together, both as a woodworking project, but also as a book project, as a storytelling project. And thankful that I did it when I did it, because obviously I wouldn't have had the chance to do it any later than I did. I'm going to read a little piece from the book, and then I'm going to tell you a little story about something that happened after we completed the book and the project that sort of will give you an idea of why my dad is so much cooler than I am. So the piece I'm going to read, I hope will give you a better idea of how I got into this weird project in the first place. For me, it began right after my father-in-law died. I accompanied my wife, Gina, the youngest of his 7 children, to the funeral home to help with the arrangements. Her dad, Augustus Owsley Hall, his Kentucky family had a tradition of taking the sons' names from the standing governor, providing he was a Democrat. He was a proud World War II Navy veteran who attended regular reunions of the crew of the USS Essex, an aircraft carrier he called home for 4 years. For all the satisfactions of his working class life and the 7 children he and his wife of 63 years raised, that was his narrative, the Essex. So the themes of service and patriotism were at the forefront as we sat together in the sterile, glossed conference room. This particular funeral home had a showroom with floor models of its casket line displayed with their hoods raised, like Corollas and Tundras at a Toyota dealership. We were ushered in for a tour. Augustus Owsley was a simple man, a child of the Great Depression, easy to please and charmingly unfashionable. He wore the same hat every day, a blue USS Essex ball cap. When he moved into an assisted care facility near the end of his life and discovered that the cafeteria offered ice cream and beer every afternoon, he knew right then that he would die a happy man. That was all he wanted or needed. So I couldn't help wondering what he would make of this endeavor. He had no personal style, at least not one that could be channeled directly into one of these wood and steel boxes. He was frugal above all things. His wardrobe consisted almost entirely of yard sale sweaters and Father's Day gifts. The price tags would be of far greater concern to him than the quality of wood or the gauge of steel. Whenever I heard him asked his opinion of anything, his answer was always, just fine. Once, when asked his favorite kind of beer, he responded, cheap. As the family listened intently, I eased away from the group. I was curious, though not sure what about. I was looking for something. And I discovered at the fringes a corpse-sized cardboard box. My bargain hunting radar went haywire. $75. And strangely, it made a statement. It had its own style. The cardboard box, amid all this polish and ostentation, had more presence than any other coffin in the place. It was humble. It was organic. It was rough. It was real. It was muted and impermanent and imperfect, and so much more like life. It was a Tom Waits song, and it was a relief. It had soul, and it was so cheap. I moved over to where Gina was grouped with her family. Come here, I said, more with facial expression than with words, employing the domestic superpower of marital telepathy. She casually separated herself from the group and followed. There it is, I said. That's what I want to be buried in. You are not going to be buried in a cardboard box. Absolutely not happening. Which was the worst thing she could have done. Like many husbands, I am a passive-aggressive contrarian. My strongest convictions are those that animate from an opposing opinion. As soon as I was told that I was not allowed to be buried in a cardboard box, I became absolutely certain that that's what I wanted. I knew right then that I would never waver. I spontaneously composed an internal declaration of postmortem independence. I am going to be buried in that box right there. You cannot deny me my final wish. Your final wish? You're 45 years old. You're not even sick. When I die, I'm going to be buried in that box right there. You won't have a say in the matter. I've already told you. It's done. You can't pretend you don't know exactly what I want, because I've told you. I want to be buried in a cardboard box. It costs $75. Fine. Then I'm just going to put it inside the biggest, most expensive gold vault I can find. I hesitated. Technically, this meant I had won, and I wondered if it was tactically prudent to protest further. In truth, her level of conviction was far greater than mine, and generations deep. Gina is half Sicilian and had an old country grandma Lucia, who, after the death of her husband, threw herself sobbing and shrieking into his casket and wore all black for 10 years. So this woman, my wife, has an elaborate, high-concept, hot-blooded Mediterranean approach to the whole ceremony of death. And the casket, to her, plays the same role as the rented white limousine in a wedding procession. I think she found the possibility of hurling her grieving self into a glorified refrigerator carton to be undignified. We rejoined the siblings. They had settled in around a gray steel number with a silver crepe interior and long handles suspended from ornate chrome fittings that looked like Dodge Ram hood ornaments. Sterling, it was called, manufactured by the Zane Casket Company of Zanesville, Ohio. It cost $2,020. The undertaker told us it was 18-gauge steel, and I took special note of this, calculating the fact that at the time I was driving a car that hadn't cost much more than $2,020, and wondering if the quality of steel in this vessel was greater than that of my actively rusting Volkswagen out in the parking lot. Gina's brother, the one who'd taken the lead in these arrangements, pointed out that the gray metal was reminiscent of a battleship, and everyone latched on to this point, so eager for some connection to Dad's legacy. Of course, it looks like a ship. It's what he would have wanted. And we nodded as though we'd found our epiphany. This is the hardest part, isn't it? Making a decision for a parent in the hope not that you have made the right decision, but rather the choice he would have thought was the right choice. The difference between those two is the difference between being someone's child and being your own self. A subtle divide most of us struggle with well beyond the keen of adolescence. What does it mean to be making decisions for the person who first made all your decisions for you, then taught you to make decisions for yourself? What is the sliding scale of right? And what if you're wrong? It was, however, in the lower end of the price range, which definitely helped. The funeral took place a few days later. As had been the case at my mother-in-law's funeral a year earlier, I was assigned to deliver the eulogy. Everyone else who might have been qualified had declined on the grounds that they were afraid of breaking down at the pulpit. I had to wonder, did my appointment indicate their perception of my emotional deficiency? Regardless, I accepted the job and set about the paralyzing task of composing a proper eulogy. For a writer, the trouble with composing a public tribute is that it eliminates the one thing all writers secretly know is the real truth of the vocation: self-exaltation. We write because it allows us to reveal our hidden awesomeness. The eulogy, however, is the one subgenre that requires perfect humility. You give yourself over not only to honoring the deceased, but also to honoring everyone else's memories of the deceased. When the deceased had 7 children, 17 grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren, that's a formula for implosion. A year before, I'd made the mistake of sending out a group email asking family members to share their memories of Gina's mom. Almost all of them centered on her kitchen table, which felt to me like a windfall, a tangible central image with a shared meaning, a conceit, a motif. From there, it all went to shit. Her pizza, a grandchild wrote. It was the best. Her movie night popcorn, offered one of the sisters. Her cream pie, another grandchild insisted. You have to mention her sauce, my brother-in-law wrote. Her midnight sandwiches, Gina followed. I loved her midnight sandwiches. She always shared them with me. And so on, such that the text began to look more like a Perkins menu than an encomium for the dead. It seemed like the greater the attempt to encapsulate the meaning of a life, the more scattered and ragged that meaning became, even for this simple woman whose legacy was sandwiches and pie. With the passing of Augustus Owsley, the same issue arose. How to contain the memory of the man? Is it simply a matter of careful arrangement within the logical corners of a box? Does the container have any meaning at all? Or does it mock meaning? Nonetheless, I put on a suit and tie, itself a container entirely foreign to my natural self, but one that Gina will surely dress me in when I die. And I delivered the formal address of remembrance, quilted together from time-softened anecdotes and images. And we adjourned to the cemetery, where the $2,020 18-gauge steel box with silver crepe interior was placed on the rolling mechanism that would lower it into a place where none of this would matter anymore. I want to be buried in a cardboard box. You are not going to be buried in a cardboard box. Gina and I had been married 25 years, over half our lives. Certain words or ideas triggered between us a rich, elaborate shared history, often spinning into well-practiced banter. As with much of the daily and nightly interaction of a long-time married couple, just because it's not spontaneous doesn't mean it's not interesting. So whenever the subject of funerals comes up in social conversation, Gina will almost invariably fire up the anecdote machine. Oh, don't even get us started on coffins, she'll say, itching for someone to get us started on coffins. David wants to be buried in a cardboard box. Do you know that a funeral home will sell you one? And somehow, this topic that would appear to represent a rift between us proves, in fact, to be something that connects us more strongly. Our argument binds us like opposing magnet poles. So I'll move forward, going on about the silliness of Gina caring at all about the accommodations of a corpse, insisting that my body, when I'm finished with it, can be thrown to the coyotes or tossed into the dumpster behind the Hobby Lobby. I toss off these one-liners like they've just occurred to me, and the only person in the room who knows how road-tested they are is Gina. Which is to say that only one person truly knows me and my motivations, and she's the one person I'm trying to suggest doesn't understand me. And she understands that I'm doing this, and I understand that she understands that I'm doing this. This is what half a life together feels like. So I'm going to just jump ahead briefly, but I should point out that the cardboard box that I had become infatuated with, I sort of found out was actually not a legitimate casket. It was actually a cremation receptacle. So basically its only quality was its flammability, but it was not suitable for burial in the ground. But somehow I pressed forward. I was too far into an argument to give it up so easily. And so it came to pass. On a March night, we were gathered together as a family at my brother's girlfriend's home to celebrate my dad's 79th birthday. We were all there. My mom, my dad, their 4 kids and significant others, their grandchildren. Our family parties are always loud and loose. And as the evening unfolds, they get louder and looser. So I go on quite a bit about the loudness of this party, but I think you get the point. There was a parrot. My family has a parrot. It's been in the family for a long time, and it's always been around. And the louder a party gets, the louder this parrot gets. And it's become sort of like part of the noise of our family. I am loud by nature because it's genetic. And my best friend, John, who I mentioned before, who's a big part of this book, one year for my birthday bought me a megaphone because I think he enjoyed pushing the button of my loudness. So I often will bring this megaphone out at parties so you get a sense of my family from this. we try to outloud each other. So this party was getting louder and louder, and I was sitting across the kitchen counter from my dad as the conversation swirled around us. Somehow or other, the subject of funerals came up. David says he's going to be buried in a cardboard box, Gina began. There's no way I'm letting him be buried in a cardboard box. Then, playing a slightly unconventional opening pattern, she preempted the counter move, jumping right in with, "Did you know you can buy a cardboard casket?" My dad latched on. "Really? A cardboard box? Can you decorate it?" I looked at him, and something about his interest set off an old trigger. If there's anything that has connected us over the course of my lifetime, it is the idea of decorated boxes. Birdhouses, barns, and most notably, the ramshackle Tudor Revival semi-mansion that he helped me and Gina save from the threshold of condemnation, and which I, for better and for worse, and thanks in great part to him, have been renovating ever since. Gina and I have raised our 2 children in a drafty 20-room manifestation of the family disease. My fondest memories of him are of watching him and helping him, learning from him. The last thing I did before moving out of the family home and setting off on my own was to construct an oak file box with finely mitered and fitted corners, built from short planks of A-grade lumber, scraps I'd squirreled away while working as a construction grunt on high-end residential jobs. A box whose antique cup handles I'd selected from one of my dad's fanciful bins of architectural salvage, whose very screws were vintage, collectible, with square brass heads. A box whose finish I'd buffed and rubbed, applying coat after coat. A box whose progress he'd watched, and on whose finer points he'd consulted. A box whose significance was, to me, vital. This box was not just the place where I expected to organize all the writing I was planning on doing in my just beginning life, but a testament to all I had learned and evidence that I still needed his help. It was my ritual of departure, my setting off point, and it returned necessarily to him. As I stood there in that kitchen, leaning on the counter, that box was back home in my office, full of ideas and failures and hopeful passages. "You and I should build my casket," I said. The corners of the old smile pulled into place. I knew exactly what that meant. So that's how we got into it. It was really nothing more than that, a lark that happened spontaneously and ended up overtaking about 4 years of our life. So we started building it, and we started building it in his workshop. And like I say, it didn't take 4 years to build it. It took 4 years to finish it, because what happened is once we got into it, life would intervene. He'd go off on a trip. I'd get busy with my teaching part of my year. We'd work on it more in the summer, and my mother's passing interrupted the process, and so forth. And so 4 years passed, and finally he's like, "We need to get this damn thing out of my workshop. It's in the way. I have things to do." So we got done, and just as we were finishing, I came over to his house one day, as I had been doing regularly, to do some work on it. And he was sitting in his kitchen looking through one of his woodworking catalogs. He was such an avid woodworker. He's always surrounded by places to buy new tools and parts for projects he was building. And he said, he goes, "Well, David, we made all the mistakes on yours. Now I'm going to build my own the right way. And so at age 84, he, in a couple of months, built his own casket, much finer, more elegant, more simple, more to the point than mine. The longer mine went on, the more, my dad was an engineer, and he was also like a whimsical artist. So he would just keep thinking of new things, new sort of decorations to add to it, new things we could do to make it more interesting. So it just kept getting more and more bigger and more elaborate. And one of the things we did while we were working on mine is we went to an Amish coffin factory, a place where Amish builders make caskets, because we had to buy a part that we couldn't find anywhere. And when we were there, he discovered this really simple, really kind of neatly pegged together pine box that he really was fascinated by. And so he built his own casket. It's in the traditional coffin shape with the angled corners, like Barnabas Collins, sleeps in. But it was really like just simple, but with these really cool details. Like he had some old black walnut that had been wood that had belonged to his dad, to my grandfather, that I remembered. It was scavenged lumber that had been wainscoting in a downtown office building in Akron. And my dad had had it all his life, and he used it to make these multicolored dovetails in the corners of this casket. And in the process, he realized that the handles wouldn't be able to be straight rails, obviously, because of the angles of the edges. And so he's trying to find casket handles. And so just on a whim, he typed into eBay, just typed casket handles. And the first listing that came up was casket handles, used, $15. And he was like, used? Well, who cares? $15 is a bargain. So he bought them, and they came. I was there when he opened the box. It was like they were dirty and rusty. They had obviously been underground for a while, and we had to wonder like why they were now for sale on eBay, but they were his now. And he reconditioned them, made them work, painted them, and he put them on his casket. And so when the time came for his funeral, and we had the showing at the funeral home, what is the most, in my opinion, the most awkward, uncomfortable, and terrible social experience we have to endure is those calling hours, where you have to make unnatural conversation with people. You don't know what to say. You don't know how to look at things. But his was like a celebration of everything that he was good at, this beautiful thing that he had built. And this, and just the way his brain worked, you could see in the way this thing was built, and everybody wanted to see it. And it wasn't as difficult to look at his corpse in it, because we were also looking at his life, like how he lived the last months of his life, doing what he loved to do. And so everybody wanted to touch it and see it and talk about it. And so it made for a great experience that I really didn't anticipate. And it made for the passing of his life into his next life a much more meaningful experience, I think, I know for me, and I think for the people who cared about him and knew him. So that's the story of Furnishing Eternity. And I think I hope I'm able to see some questions. Oh, I see. Okay. I'm figuring this out on the fly. Here are your comments. Let me see if I can find. Oh, great. Garbled and feedback. That's not good. Okay. I got hashtagged as a passive-aggressive contrarian. The secret is out. Questions. Okay. So I see that there are some people out there. Hi. Hello, 100 or so miles away in Wheeling. How are you? Well, since I have a captive audience, I'll briefly tell you about my new book, which is coming out in August. Lunch with Books says, tell us about your new book. How about that? Great minds think alike, Sean Duffy. I have a new book coming out on August 25th. It's called Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America. This book is about, I spent a year traveling Ohio. Ohio is traditionally seen as a bellwether of the nation. It has unique qualities that make it that make it a microcosm of where the country is, especially politically and especially during presidential election seasons. So I spent a year from March 2019 to March 2020 traveling around Ohio, listening to people, going to places that tell the national story, looking for events that were reflective of the national mood and experience, and writing this book, Barnstorming Ohio. It begins, in the heat of the Trump presidency. It ends with the beginning of the pandemic. And I hope it gives insight into who we are and where we are heading at a time when so much of who we are and where we are heading is chaotic and uncertain in ways that I don't think we've known in our lifetimes. Interestingly, one of the places that I spent time at is Martins Ferry, Ohio, which if you look out your window, some of you could probably see Martins Ferry across the river. I actually stayed in Wheeling when I was there. And so I think a lot of kind of your story as residents of Wheeling, I hope, will be reflected in that chapter. It's very much about some of the economic struggles of that region, some of the philosophical and political points of view that have been part of the Trump phenomenon, and so forth. So let me see. Somebody asks, do you share a picture of the coffin in your book? There is a picture of it in process in the book, so you can see that. Thank you, Barbara George. I read this book a few weeks ago. I enjoyed the mix of humor and profound commentary about grief, a tricky combination. It was successful in my eyes. I'm glad you mentioned that there's humor in it. I hope that in some ways this is a funny book. It's, there's an old saying that that tragedy is, or humor is tragedy plus time. And I really believe that. And I also believe that the way that the dramatic masks are intertwined, the laughing and the crying, that those two emotions are very mixed together. And so it was interesting in terms of writing about some of the saddest times of my life to also recognize the humor that the people who I was sad about had given me, especially my mom. My mom had a really wry and wicked sense of humor. Grew up in Martins Ferry, good town. Yes, it is. I love Martins Ferry. I had a really cool experience there. I got to write about James Wright, the poet, the American poet, who's from Martins Ferry and has written about the Ohio Valley and that region, or did write about it in his life. Is kind of throughout that chapter. So a quick story about my mom. Oh, I heard burlap sacks are an option for burial these days. Return to nature sounds okay to me. Yeah, one of the things I wrote about in Furnishing Eternity is the trend toward green burial, which I'm super interested in. I think it's a great idea. And in fact, one of the first green cemeteries in the country is in Ohio. It's in, I believe, in Stark County. And the concept is you can be, if you're buried in one of these places, you have a traditional underground burial, but you can only be buried in biodegradable wrappings. You're not even, I think you can be buried in like a coffin, but it has to be entirely biodegradable, but they prefer that you're just wrapped in cloth. And you can have a stone, but it can't be a polished stone. In fact, they like you to have a stone, a marking of some sort, because it provides habitat for the wildlife that lives there. And so it's a natural site that's also a memorial site. And I think it's a really cool concept. So yes, will you be buried in the coffin you built? I will. I've had an evolving relationship because, like I said, as this thing went on, this casket got bigger and heavier. It's big. And so the first thing I had to figure out was like, what am I going to do with, like, how am I going to store it? And it's sort of a spoiler alert, but in the book, like, there's this ongoing, like, Gina, throughout these 4 years, she's like, where are we going to keep this thing? And I would always say, oh, I don't worry, I have that figured out. Which anytime a husband says, don't worry, I've got it figured out, this is a sort of little, I'm letting you in on a secret, that means he has no idea. So I didn't really know what I was going to do with this. But at one point, my dad and I had to stand it on end to get it out of the way to set something up in his workshop. And when it was on end, I looked at it and I was like, Dad, you know, that would make a really nice looking bookcase. And so what I have done is I've fitted it with removable set of shelves. And so it stands on end in our house, and we use it as a bookshelf, and we actually use it specifically to display pictures and artifacts of the people we love. And so it sort of serves as kind of a box full of life, I guess, and family in our house. The unfortunate thing is that the only place that it fit is in this hallway directly outside of our bedroom door. So the first thing Gina and I see when we get up in the morning is my final resting place, which is a little weird. But if you think about it, if every morning the first thing that occurs to you when you wake up is that you're going to die someday, put you on your game. So get coffee and get to work. So that's true. But yeah, so I recently have gotten Gina, she's watching, so she might reach through the screen and wag a finger at me. But I think I've gotten her to agree to my desire to, yeah, like, be put into this box and go through the traditional funeral home experience with it and the traditional Catholic funeral mass. But then I would like to be cremated in the box when it's finished, because I just feel like, I don't know, something feels right about that to me, that it's a dramatic ending. Wood is meant to be burned, and yeah, and it just seems like it puts less bad things into the ground. So yeah, when will your new book be out? Thank you for asking. August 25th, the new book comes out. I'm about to undergo a really interesting experience. I'm going into the studio starting Thursday to read the audiobook of Barnstorming, Ohio. I haven't read one of my audiobooks before, and so this will be a new experience, and I'm looking forward to it with interest, but also a little bit of trepidation, because I don't know what it's going to be like to read for 6 hours a day for like 5 days straight, but that's what's going to happen. So usually when I'm live at a library, I'll say, like, is there one more question? And I'll give a second, and then what'll happen is either someone will ask one last question, which I'll wait to see if somebody does, and if not, then I go over to the table where I sell lots of books and sign them for the audience. And so unfortunately, we won't be able to do the book signing thing, and I won't get to sell. Usually I sell like 500 books, not really, at one of these events. But I hope if you're interested that you'll go to your wherever you buy your books and pre-order a copy of Barnstorming, Ohio, or perhaps order a copy of Furnishing Eternity. and you'll buy a book and maybe I'll get to see you in person someday. Let's see, I'm being asked to tell about the lava, I don't know how to, there's this lava lamp. So like many people, beginning in March, much of my professional and social life transitioned into this thing. And the first thing I learned is that my desktop computer, which is right next to me, which I do almost all of my work on, and it's sort of like my appendage, the camera doesn't work on it. So I've transitioned to my laptop. And the second thing I learned is that some people just either are lucky enough to have beautiful natural light in wherever they do these live streams from, or they've learned how to adapt. And I've just been like trying to figure it out on the fly. And then like people usually like have their bookshelves behind them. Well, just so happens the only angle that I have has one of, like I have way too many books. So one of the places where I have some books is sort of here, and it has a lava lamp on top of it. So the lava lamp has kind of become my like Skype, like WebEx calling card. So I didn't realize that until people started mentioning it. So that's the story of the lava lamp. So Sean, hearing no further objection, I'm going to say goodbye. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. Thanks so much to Sean Duffy and the Ohio County Public Library for doing this. Now more than ever, support your public library. There's an old saying that becomes more true with every change in American life, that libraries will get you through times of no money more than money will get you through times of no libraries. So support your public library. Vote for your library levies this November. Vote this November. This might be the most important election of our lifetimes. And I hope if you read Barnstorming, Ohio, it will give you some insight into why. Thank you and goodbye.